You're listening to Sox in the Basement, a production of the Broadcast Basement Limited, where every show is 30 minutes of good and comes from a basement bar on the south side of Chicago. Pull up a stool, pour a cold one, and join us right now for Sox in the Basement. Heard everywhere podcasts can be found, and always at soxinthebasement.com. The expose in The Athletic, and I'm calling it an expose because this is not just an article. This is an expose in which Britt Giroli and Ken Rosenthal put out on Thursday, is maybe the finest piece of literature that I've ever read. Like, as a youngster, a teenager, I read the full unabridged version of Stephen King's The Stand, and it was like my favorite book. In college, I took journalism classes where I would have to, do these English courses and read these beautiful pieces of literature. None of them compare to this article, which every White Sox fan should take, print out off of The Athletic. Totally worth the $2 this month to subscribe, which I had to do. Because
absolutely subscribe.
I stopped using The Athletic when they stopped having a Chicago beat reporter because I was angry about it. But I resubscribed for this thing. Print out the article and keep it in your back pocket. For any time somebody from the Jerry Reinsdorf circle, somebody from the team, some misguided fan ever tries to defend the organization and the owner, just have it at the ready. Because everything in it is not only what you suspected was going on, but it's confirmed. It is the most amazing thing in the world. And Kenny Williams comes off as a total jagbag.
Well, I mean,
he is everything that I expected him to be and more.
He's also one of the few people who went on record of the major front office players, right? That they interviewed. Kenny Williams is the only one who felt like he was going to comment, and at one point he determined that his comments would not lead him to be the person he aspires to be, or something along those lines.
He loves to hear himself talk. That's why he runs out in front of the cameras when there's a big moment. And he did it right here in this article, and he sunk himself forever. He exposed what he was with this quote right here in the middle of this article, because you learn a lot. You learn that Jerry Reinsdorf may not be an evil person, but he's a fool. That's how he's portrayed in the article. A fool. He's a bad baseball fan. He's that guy to just sit with at the game who thinks he knows a lot about baseball, but you realize in the middle of the conversation, he's a fool. But he owns the team, so he runs it foolishly. But the most amazing quote from Kenny Williams was, quote, "I was known as and called a baseball guy. It was like it was an insult that I could go in and see a guy work out for a day and tell you he was going to be an all-star." End quote. Kenny, that is the biggest load of crap. If you were actually able to do that, we would have won a lot more. You were a guy who could just walk in and just watch a guy work out for a day, and you knew he was going to be an all-star? Where's the results of that? Where is that proven, you pompous ass?
You produced 0 all-stars, my man. Kenny Williams was a guy who was one of those guys that walks around shopping malls back in the day and says, "I'm a model photographer." Okay. He would walk into a workout and he would see a guy's rippling muscles, and he would see how fast he could run. He could see how hard he could throw a ball, not accurately, but how hard he could throw a ball. And he'd sit there and go, "This man's a star." And and then you'd get him onto a baseball field and he's, incapable of making connection with even the most basic fastball. He's incapable of catching the ball. He's incapable of understanding how to steal a base. He didn't produce.
Kenny was the problem. Like Jerry's a problem, but Kenny was a big problem. And again, hats off to Ken Rosenthal and Britt Giroli for what they wrote. And Ken Rosenthal being on the article, I mean, Britt is a great journalist. She's got an awful lot of respect around baseball. She's really good at what she does. I love her work. Ken Rosenthal is like that guy in the upper echelon rare air, where when Jerry hears about this and reads it, because he will, and he wants retribution, he won't be able to do it because Ken Rosenthal is so well respected in the game. He won't be able to do to Ken Rosenthal what he did to Jason Benetti, which is confirmed inside this article, that Jerry Reinsdorf texts his broadcasters in game to complain about stuff they say during the broadcast while they're working. and got rid of Benetti because he didn't like his sense of humor, didn't like his love of analytics, and didn't like the way he talked about his baseball team. It's right there. Like, he's out the door because what Jerry wants is the fool that's in there
John
now
Schifrin,
who's yelling South Side stand up and screaming into the microphone that's 100% positivity. That's why that guy was hired. It's right there. It's amazing to read what happened over the last couple of years, like to understand that Kenny Williams had stepped back and let Rick Hahn run the rebuild and then declared to everybody like he was Michael Jordan. This is how it's described. Like, I'm coming out of retirement. I'm back. Like, and he says, I'm taking the reins all of a sudden in 2020 and helps drive this thing right into the ground. That he enables his son to have such a voice in the front office that Hahn has to have his guy and his son, like there's factions inside fighting with each other. And the power that was given to Kenny's boy. It's crazy to me. Just absolutely nuts to read it. And it's what you always suspected was going on. But it's right there now. Now it's confirmed by people within the organization. Like, they did a great job. They got sources that backed up those sources. They went into the weeds and they discovered everything that everybody kind of assumed was going on behind the scenes in that front office. The failure of hiring Tony La Russa and why he was hired, and that Hahn really did want AJ Hinch. Confirmed. That Kenny is stepping in the way of moves that Hahn wants to make. That Hahn wants to have analytics and change the way that we're doing things and the structure of the team, and the resistances from these old school baseball fools who still think that the game is played the way it was when Jackie Robinson was on the field.
Because that's what Ken Rosenthal and Bricciaroli basically paint Jerry Reinsdorf as. When you hear people defend Reinsdorf and say, well, he loves the game of baseball like no other, I've always sort of believed that. Like, I can believe that Jerry Reinsdorf is a huge baseball fan. I have no qualms about admitting that the man might really love the idea of owning a baseball team. He might really love the White Sox. He might really love Major League Baseball. But I think it's always been clear that his ideas are rooted so far in the past. And all you have to do is look at how often he has bristled against changes in the labor with Major League Baseball. The ideas around the ballpark, I mean, the ballpark that he built versus what was coming out immediately after with Camden Yards and some of the other really gorgeous ballparks that have unique features and things like that. And he built them all on the south side of Chicago. He built a big concrete thing. And it's just one of those where I think you know in your heart that Jerry's big problem is that Jerry has never, ever advanced beyond a certain era of baseball, a certain era of business. And that's what this article says.
And he cuts the legs out from underneath anybody that tries to show him there's a better way of doing things, because he just believes, like, his faith in Tony La Russa, because he's a Hall of Fame manager, that Tony really is a genius and that we cannot not get Tony's opinion on everything. It's crushing as a fan of the team, because you understand the dysfunction that's going on inside of the building. The amazing thing that this article starts off with is the plane.
The plane. I love the fact that it starts off with the plane.
When you're reading about the plane that the team uses, you immediately picture that scene in Major League when they're like, is that our plane? And somebody goes, no, this is your plane. And the propeller plane pulls up with Chief Wahoo on the side of it. And it looks like it could fall on the sky.
Duct taping the prop onto it.
That's what the White Sox are flying.
They're trading magazines of classic literature.
Right. That's what the White Sox are flying. And that's why,
more or less,
that's why players don't want to come where they're all sitting coach and they're crammed in next to each other. They make fun of it to each other. Like, it shows that the players on the team think that the organization they play for is a garbage organization. It explains to you why players hire Scott Boras and say, I'm going to free agency. Why players say, I can't wait to get off of this team because this isn't even a major league ball club. It is not necessarily because Jerry Reinsdorf doesn't want to pay him any money. I mean, he doesn't really want to, but it's also the fact that they don't feel like they're really in Major League Baseball until they play for anybody but the Chicago White Sox. Sox in the Basement listeners, for exterior windows, doors, patio doors, and storm doors, look no further than Window and Door Superstore of Oak Forest. They are not traveling salesmen who show up at your door with a dingy little example and you got to look in a book and try to pick out what your windows are going to look like. Instead, get into their big, beautiful showroom where there's an owner on site and also on site when they put in your windows. All Window and Door Superstore installers, they don't farm out the work. They've been doing it that way for 40 years in Oak Forest since 1985. All major brands are custom made and no stock items for a perfect fit. Window and Door Superstore of Oak Forest is 1/2 block east of 159th and Ridgeland at 6280 159th Street. See more at windowdooroakforest.com. Joining me on the phone line right now, our good friend, the SoxNerd, Dave Marin, who puts all those incredible tidbits up on the scoreboard. So many historical things happening this year. He's got much more to talk about, even though the season is almost done. And he's brought to you by the Village of Lamont. Want to experience downtown with real history, great eats and drinks, and green spaces filled with adventure? Visit the Village of Lamont. Shop, dine, drink, explore. And if you're listening to this show on the day it comes out, the 21st of September, get out to Lamont. I'm there all day at the Forge. Pollyanna Oktoberfest. There's a Sox in the Basement tent. You'll see our logo up on the stage. And I cannot wait to be out there, depending on what part of the day you're listening to this at. It depends on how many giant steins of beer that I have had. See more at lamontdowntown.com. Nerd, what do you got for me?
Chris, I'm going hard to the finish line. I've got no theme this week, but just a series of nuggets. Here goes. The Dodgers' Shohei Ohtani is in the midst of the first 50-50 season in MLB history. The closest the Sox have come to a season like this is when Luis Robert Jr. hit 39 homers with 20 steals just last season. That 13-inning loss on Wednesday was kind of interesting. The game in Anaheim was the Sox' longest on the road since a 15-inning win in Philadelphia on August 2nd, 2019, in a game where Phillies pitcher Vince Velasquez threw out Jose Abreu at the plate in the 14th. The Sox used 8 pitchers in the Wednesday game against the Angels, which is tied for the 8th most in franchise history. The last time the Sox used more than 8 pitchers was in the aforementioned game against the Phillies when they used 9. The Sox employed a club record 10 pitchers in a 12-11 loss in 14 innings at Oakland on April 18, 2018. The Sox starter in that one was Carson Fulmer, who was the 4th of the Angels' 8 hurlers on Wednesday. Wednesday was also the White Sox 38th game all-time playing as a 100-loss team. It was their longest by innings with 100 Ls, surpassing the loss in 12 they suffered to the Brewers for defeat number 101 on September 26, 1970. By the way, the 1932 Sox were 3-2-1 while playing with triple-digit defeats. Andrew Benintendi's walk-off homer on September 14th was the first by a White Sox lefty off a lefty since Robin Ventura went deep off the Orioles' Randy Myers on August 9, 1996. Benintendi and Ventura, who did it twice, are the only Sox lefties with walk-off blasts off lefties in the Sox current home. On September 15th, Sean Burke made the first White Sox start at any position and earned the Sox first win by a University of Maryland product since Tom Bradley went the distance for the win and fan 10 against Texas on September 29, 1972. The Sox, by the way, used Bradley to pry Ken Henderson and an up-and-coming pitcher by the name of Steve Stone from San Francisco in a trade after that season. Before I get to my zinger, a reminder, you can access my blog at soxinthebasement.com, and there is plenty of SoxNerd material on Twitter and on the scoreboard at Guaranteed Rate Field. My zinger, the White Sox play their home finale on September 26th. The Sox have lost their last 4 home closers, with the last win coming in 2019 thanks to a 5-0 victory over Detroit. And this is the first season since 2018 the Sox end the regular season on the road, and the first time since 2009 the Sox will finish in Detroit. That's it, Chris. Probably more than you wanted to know about Shohei, Vince Velasquez, Carson Fulmer, and the bespectacled Tom Bradley.
Joining me on the phone line right now, our good friend from FutureSox, friend of the show, James Fox is on the line. How are you, James?
Hey, Chris, how's it going, man?
Listen, we have sat around and talked about this team and stuff that we've heard about going on in the front office and rumors that we've heard and unconfirmed stuff, and we've always had a picture of what it was, and it was amazing to see it all in print in that Athletic article. To me, it was validation, and it was nice that everybody could see it, because some of that stuff, you didn't want to say it out loud, because you're like, well, if I'm wrong, I'm kind of slandering people, but I mean, like, it was really going on like that.
Yeah, I heard a lot of that stuff, right? And it's just like the Kenny stuff specifically, and like just how like even like department heads, like they just like try to hang on for dear life and tell Jerry whatever he needs to like stay employed, because like obviously Jerry's best and worst qualities are his loyalty, right? It's great to be loyal, and you know, you send a lot of kids through college, but like when you're running a business, right, like you have to get rid of these people that don't know what they're doing. I was just like, what about like the range of pieces that came out this week? Because like I kind of think like Jeff Passan is like the gold standard, right? And then his article was like very positive because he like spent time with the team, I guess, and like the Brian Mahler stuff came out and he treated that as a positive. And then the Garoli Rosenthal piece drops and it's just like, okay, this is like the scathing Reinsdorf one. So I'm sure we'll get a few more because they're very likely to, you know, break the all-time losses record and more people will be writing about this team. But yeah, it's pretty interesting that like some of this stuff like just like decided to kind of get reported now.
It's probably the best thing that they're going to break a record because it made everybody pay attention to them. Like if they would have been 10 games better, there's probably nothing written about them.
This doesn't come out.
This comes out because of how historic it is, and a light is shined into the darkness. And it's funny, you get a guy like Kenny Williams who just cannot help himself. Like somebody said, we'd like to use it for an article. And he didn't care that he was basically hanging himself because he comes across in that article as a villain and as a problem and as one of the causes for all the dysfunction. And he looks terrible in it and arrogant. And it's amazing that he just can't get out of his own way and sits down and has that conversation.
Well, and some of it too, like I don't know what Rick Hahn was like expecting, right? It seems like there's multiple instances where it's like, okay, Rick Hahn seems like a very intelligent man and he's not a baseball scout, right? But he can listen to people around him. But it's like, how did you think you were actually in charge? Like with Kenny hanging around or like with Jerry, like, you know, just like making these decisions, like the Hinch stuff in there was everything that I had confirmed at the time. Like I had written an article for Southside Sox about all these interviews that they were going to do. And then they were ultimately going to hire AJ Hinch because it was Hahn's guy. And it's right in there. Like baseball reporters 5 minutes after they fired Rick Renteria were like, oh yeah, AJ Hinch is the favorite. Right. And then Nightingale dropped the bomb that the La Russa stuff was happening. Like, I just like don't know how Hahn let this stuff happen to him, like year after year after year, right? And Kenny and Rick couldn't figure out how to work like under the weird restrictions that Jerry had. And it's just the whole thing. It's just like we've always said, it's like Larry's hardware store. It's like so many similarities to like Major League. It's bad. And Kenny comes off as the arrogant, like totalitarian that he like was, that he turned, you know, he couldn't let go of the rope, right? He's like, I'm going to go upstairs and let Rick take care of it until it's time to win. Then I'm going to like come back downstairs and micromanage everybody. Like there's countless draft stories of Kenny just coming into the room and taking a guy, you know, or like, I mean, he made the Jake Eater for Jake Berger trade. That seemed to be the final straw, right? But it's just over and over again with Ken Williams because they won one title and then they tried to replicate it for like the next 15 years and it just like never worked again.
So one of the things we talked about on our previous show was the amount of payroll flexibility that Chris Getz has. And I actually said, you get him down to about $93 million at the bottom of MLB payroll, and you only really are committed to Robert Jr. and Benintendi, and you got a couple of buyouts and everybody else is ARB or pre-ARB. You could have $50 million to make decisions either with the roster or even behind the scenes. And you read that article and you get the impression, and now that there's only one voice speaking to Jerry, that Chris Getz at least understands something needs to change. Like he brought a whole committee out and they looked at everything going on inside of the team and they made a presentation to the old man like, hey, wake up. You're doing a bad job. So there could be changes. So do you think they'll spend that money? It would still be one of the lower payrolls in baseball. They'd be right at the bottom. And is it all on players, Or is it Getz saying, you know what, I'm going to start fixing some of these things. You know, Jerry, instead of buying a $10 million player, I need $10 million to change what we do.
Yeah, I think it's going to be a lot of that. But, like, how much does infrastructure really cost? Like, what is an analytics department going to cost you? Like a middle reliever? You know? Like, it's not, like, that much money. That's why neglecting it for this long, like, doesn't make any sense, right? Like, it's just you're, like, robbing Peter to pay Paul this whole time because you want to sign Austin Jackson or Juan Pierre. Like, it's never made any sense. I think the good thing about Chris Getz is, like, it seems like, and I'll preface this by saying, I have no idea whether Chris Getz can, like, evaluate players, right? And if he trades and acquires the wrong players, like, it's not going to work. But he seemingly understands the assignment, and I think he understands, like, the man that he, like, works for ultimately, too. And I don't know if, like, the two-headed Kenny Rick monster ever truly understood, you know, like, the guy that they work for. And I know you've, like, talked about that on older shows, right? Like, figure out the areas where you're good, where you can, like, build from within, and then what you can spend at the end, right? Like, put that all together. Like, develop pitching so you can buy bats, like, that sort of thing. But yeah, I mean, it seems like, you know, they said they're not going heavy in free agency. I don't really know what that means. I'm pretty sure there will be some free agents because you can't go with all kids. And like you said, they just don't have much money committed. Like, I think, you know, like, I think a left-handed DH of some sort to, like, complement either Andrew Vaughn or Tim Elko or whatever you feel like doing. And then I've said on our Future Sox podcast, like, I would spend significant dollars, like, on the bullpen, but not because I'm trying to win, because I'm trying to get, like, a closer and a setup guy that are both good, like David Robertson types, Aroldis Chapman, like that sort of thing, right? A guy that can come and save games for you, and then you can trade him at the deadline and get something nice like other teams have done. If you're going to spend a little bit of money on John Brebbia, like, I would just go a little bit deeper and get somebody better. Like, if your whole plan is going to be go young and have some guys to trade at the deadline. So I do think there will be some moves just because there kind of has to be. They don't have enough players.
Yeah, I mean, you can find a couple of bats and you can add a few guys that are capital that you can move because you know you're not winning, but you could be a much better team than this. I mean, you should never be this again. I think that's what White Sox fans need to see, right? Like, they need to see an offseason where you at least can tell what the plan is, and you know it's not going to be like this again. And you start to, I want to hear anecdotes like, we're doing things differently now. We're not just telling a pitcher, you know, work on your command and have a good 6 months. Yeah. Like, I mean, like we talked about on this show when we talked about all the injuries. I have a good friend of mine who does rehab of athletes. He's got MLB athletes that he actually works with in the offseason. And what he talks about is the fact that, like, you know, most Major League Baseball teams would make sure that their guys that are traveling out of the country have somebody that's going to make sure that they're working for the next 6 months. And it's like the White Sox don't invest in that kind of thing. And that's where some of these injuries must come from, because the guys aren't even doing the right exercises in the offseason. Like, if I start hearing there's a better way of doing things happening behind the scenes, and I continue to see guys like Marco Patti shown the door, then I start to believe that, well, even if Chris Getz isn't great at talent evaluation, he may be surrounding himself with people who are. And that's all I can ask for.
Yeah, it's very positive if he, like, knows what he's not great at, right? Like, he knew he could not come in and, like, fix the White Sox pitching. So he hired Brian Bannister, right? So I'm hoping that, like, a similar hire, and I've said this on your show, obviously, but, like, I'm hoping that the similar hire comes on the hitting side, and the new international director is coming, and there's more employees to come and help with the things that you are deficient at. But, like, one of the issues has always been, like, the roadblock of the owner, right? The owner just, like, doesn't want to allocate the resources to spend on those sorts of things. And I've always kind of wondered if that's, like, a hard no, or if it's a hard no along with, like, your normal baseball ops spending, right? So I do think if it's, hey, we have to sacrifice, like, the big league team to, like, fix all these systems and pay all this. I think Getz will do that because I think he'll see that it's worth it in the long run. But I don't know how true that is. Like, I don't know if that's an option that Kenny and Rick just didn't use or what, but it kind of seems like it's kind of going that direction.
All right. Well, since you're the Future Sox guy, since you're my prospect guy, I got to ask you before we're done, and we've talked about it a little bit on the show. I feel very positive about an Edgar Caro likely making it to the majors next year, and I'm excited to see what he can do because he got to AAA and he seemed like he was performing. And I've completely, in my mind, just lost faith in Colson Montgomery after watching his AAA season. So you going to talk me off the ledge with Montgomery, or what is your evaluation of these two guys? Because I know we've got good young pitching, but I'm trying to find the hitting.
Yeah, I'm curious to see what they do at catcher. It should be Caro for like the majority of 2025. Now, I don't know if they go with like a vet first, like with Lee, and then Caro's up in like a couple weeks or something, or if they just go with Caro and Lee. But he's definitely the future at catcher. He's had a really strong season. So Colson Montgomery over his last 22 games has been pretty good. I think he's like maybe started to figure out AAA a little bit. I retweeted something that somebody, Adam Sager, tweeted like some Colson stats over the last 22 that have been pretty good. So look, that doesn't mean that he's figuring it out, but it's better than it's been. And I agree with something Jim Callis told us on our podcast. Like if you're the White Sox, like Colson Montgomery, to me, doesn't make the White Sox next year out of spring training, regardless of what he does. Like, he could hit 700 in spring training, kid, and you're going to Charlotte because you're going to prove to me that, you can do this at Charlotte. You're going to earn your way to Chicago. So I do think, Colson Montgomery spends the majority of the season in Chicago, but I would not start him there opening day just because I don't think he's, like, earned that. And I would make that a prerequisite. And that's where, look, like if you add a couple, that's why like next year, like people say like, oh, they might be worse next year. I don't know about that, but it's also like you'll have pieces to watch that might be on your next good White Sox team, where this year you did not have that. That's why this year's terrible, right? Because like none of these guys really matter all that much. Like if you're bad next year, because you're blowing leads, but Brian Ramos and Colson Montgomery and Edgar Caro look like they're going to be on your next good team. Well, that's like not the end of the world. You know what I mean? And then you have a bunch of young pitching that you're going to like, and you probably see Noah Schultz and Hagen next year. So yeah, I think next year is better. But it's it's going to be a lot of kids for sure, I would think.
One more thing. You mentioned it early in the interview. I got to circle back to it. You had like a throw-in line like Andrew Vaughn or Tim Elko or whatever they're going to be doing there. And it never even crossed my mind. I have suggested the idea you can't keep Sheets and Vaughn on this team. They're basically replacement level players. And do you really want to pay Vaughn $4 or $5 million to be a 0 WAR or a 0.5 WAR? Or are you ready to just move on and continue to find the assets you need to make changes? Do you really think a guy like Elko could be a part of things next year?
I mean, I don't see why you wouldn't try. I mean, I think Tim Elko is one of these guys who is like going to be a little bit limited because he doesn't walk a ton, but I think he understands like you're in a run producing role, like for a reason, right? So like he's going to come up and the power will play. It'll just depend on like how many strikeouts is it truly. Like he's good at first base. Like to me, I don't know how you pay Andrew Vaughn $5 million in arbitration. I know they might want to give him another chance because it's like the guy they drafted or whatever, but that just like doesn't make any sense to me. I know you talked about it on your previous show with Ed. Like, I don't know, like Andrew Vaughn's a non-tender for me.
Yeah, me
because
too.
It's just not enough value. He's not worth $5 million, So, and keeping Sheets doesn't make any sense either because he's a first baseman. And he has 10 homers. Like, no, I think he's a definite non-tender. Vaughn, I'm not sure. Vaughn, I would do, you would do, but I'm not sure they would do it. And yeah, I mean, you have Tim Elko at Charlotte, and he's going to go to the Arizona Fall League, and we'll see how he does. But there's no reason why you can't play Tim Elko at first and, get a lefty. I talked about like a Dan Vogelbach type or, just like one of these guys that's like bounced around. It's like, oh, this is our lefty DH. Okay. And you kind of just like mix and match with those guys like on the big league level because it doesn't really matter all that much. But you see if you can get something out of Tim Elko, then there's no reason not to try at this point. Instead of like hitting yourself in the head with a hammer, hoping Andrew Vaughn's going to like suddenly get better.
James Fox, Future Sox, check him out. It's always wonderful when he comes on the show. Thanks a lot, buddy.
All righty, thanks for having me.
It turns out that Chris Getz is trying. Like, yes. Chris Getz being in there, like it really gets into the fact that he never went outside the organization, and a lot of people wanted Jerry to do that. And he broke basically the C-League rule by hiring internally and not interviewing anybody else, and somehow was allowed to get away with it by Major League Baseball, which is ridiculous.
Because he's Jerry Reinsdorf.
He's Jerry
That's
Reinsdorf.
Why.
But that Getz at least watched what happened. We talked about this when Getz was hired. My hope was that what Chris Getz was a guy who was watching this internal strife and these factions fighting with each other while this fool of an owner allowed it to fester and get worse. And he at least knew how to talk to the old man and would come up with a way to make his point. And it goes into the idea that Getz did bring in Brian Bannister, Josh Barfield, Jin Wong into the front office and has a committee that was put together to evaluate all facets of the organization. And they recently presented their findings and a plan for the future to Reinsdorf. And the quote from Getz is, quote, "My experience so far is if it can be presented in a way that is educated and you use the people you have around you, it is well received. Jerry now has a better understanding of the value of analytics. He's very open-minded and supportive of investing further." That quote from Getz, where he's probably worried about how it comes across in the totality of the article, because the article paints his boss as a fool and paints Getz as a guy who probably shouldn't have been the hire, but at least seems to understand this organization is a mess. And the only way he can fix it is if he overwhelmingly brings in people from the outside and then has them present to his owner this big giant plan evaluating his entire team. And they have to convince this fool in the office who sits in there with his memorabilia and his memories of how baseball used to be, who holds all the power and meddles in every little part of the team and gets in the way of its success. And he understands that he has to bring basically a consortium, like one voice, a consortium that is one voice into the office and make big presentations to this guy to convince him to change his course. Like, that was the one positive thing that Getz is doing. You don't know if it'll be successful. And I'm sure he's a little nervous today reading the article. Like, this really comes across that I understand he's a fool too. It really does. It kind of comes across that Getz gets that this owner does not understand what he needs to do. And I have to walk him through it. Hopefully that doesn't mean that he's out the door and Jerry replaces him with Tony. Because I believe anything could happen at this point after reading this article.
That would be the way, wouldn't it? Wouldn't that be?
He loves Tony in this article. Tony La Russa is too involved in this team. It is very apparent, and Jerry Reinsdorf gets in the way of everything, down to texting his announcers when he doesn't like something they say in the middle of their broadcast. And shooing away analytics people because he doesn't believe in analytics. Like, you have to beg him to do the things that other teams do while he flies around on his junker plane that could fall out of the sky at any moment with his unhappy players that are not well rested when they go to the West Coast. Again, this explains why West Coast trips are always bad.
Doesn't it, though?
Sox in the basement. Sox in the basement. Sox in the basement.
Sox in the Basement. Heard everywhere podcasts can be found, and always on soxinthebasement.com.